Hi and welcome everybody to the This Is Ibrox end of season review. It's a very special one. We're here at the Podcast Studios in Glasgow. I'm joined by Tommy McIntyre. How are you today, Tommy?
I'm good, thank you. Looking forward to, I don't know if I'm actually looking forward to pulling back over the season, but we might as well do it.
And fellow co-host Craig Dennett. How are you today, Craig?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I think I have to agree with Tommy there. I'm not sure how much fun this will be, but I'm sure we'll get into some of the fonder memories of the season if we can.
That's it. And Ross Chalmers, how are you today, Ross, as well?
Yeah, I'm good. I feel the same way as Tommy and Craig here, that maybe some ground we're going to go over that wasn't the best for us this season, but of course that's what we're here to do. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Right, so we've got 4 people in agreement here. Right, thanks very much for joining. Thanks for tuning in. That's us out the door.
Easy peasy. That's it. I know, well, there's plenty to discuss. We'll get into it. We're planning on giving you an in-depth review of the season, some of the highs, some of the lows, and we'll get into it, straight into it in the 2022-23 campaign. We'll begin our way back on the 2nd of August, where Rangers began their Champions League qualification in the third round, and you can pick me up on my pronunciation here, Ross, as I know it's a speciality of yours. We played Union Saint-Gilloise. The opening game was a bit of a disaster. Rangers were defeated 2-0 away. If I remember correctly, there was a very contentious penalty awarded against Connor Goldson in that game. Then in the return leg, Rangers won by 3-0. A Tav penalty, of course, a Cholak goal, and Malik Tillman was doing his best impression of Cristiano Ronaldo in that game. Then Rangers faced PS Eindhoven at home, resulting in a 2-2 draw, Cholak goal, and a 30-yard... I was going to say screamer, but it wasn't really a screamer. It was a bit of a sclaff from the...
A goalkeeping howler.
Yeah,
that's the best way to describe that one.
I seem to remember Singari having a pretty good game in that for PSV as well. Then in the away leg, Rangers scored with Antonio Cholak going through on goal with a Malik Tillman pass to get us through to the Champions League proper. I'll come to you first, Ross, on this. How important was it for Rangers that they made the Champions League group stages this year?
Yeah, I think it was really important, Kyle. I actually remember after the final whistle in Eindhoven being quite emotional that night for Rangers. I felt it was a big moment for us. It'd been a long time, 12 years, I think, since we'd been in the Champions League. And I felt it was really important we got there. Of course, we're going to go into how that Champions League campaign went, but at the time, it felt really, really big for the club to be there. And look, we were up again. There was some tough ties in there. It was a very good pronunciation from yourself there. Yeah, Union Saint-Gilloise and PSV Eindhoven. I remember that night PSV were very good at Ibrox, and probably Rangers were maybe a wee bit fortunate to get a draw that night. That was a tough game. And over there, I think it was very much backs against the wall for the first half, and we've managed to grab the game with a mistake, you've got to say, from the PSV centre-back. So, look, I think after that game, I felt it was a really big moment for us. I think we could really kick on. I felt there was going to be a lot of investment coming that summer after it because of the guaranteed Champions League money that supposedly you get. Of course, we've found out over the last year that it's maybe not as much as you would expect. But yeah, at the time, Kyle felt a really, really big moment for the club, and it was a really emotional night, actually, thinking back about it.
Yeah, I think emotional is a good way to describe it. It was a lot of people, it signified that we're back getting into the Champions League proper. Craig, I'll come on to you next. What did that moment mean for the support? What did it signify to the support that we were back in the Champions League?
I think it was more money related than anything else, if we are brutally honest about it. I think the first game, the away leg in Belgium, was the typical what you expect from a first competitive game for Rangers. We've seen it so many times over the years. You go into these Champions League qualifiers, you've played 3 or 4 games as friendlies, building up to it. You think you're in okay form. You go into the competitive game and you're just hit by a sucker punch from a team that we had, being honest, before we played them, we had not heard of them before. We had no scope as to how good or how bad they were. Now we've seen them get to the quarterfinals of the Europa League this year, and we know how difficult that can be. So they're by no means mugs, but at that point we'd never heard of them before. We've got them standing between us and a playoff round to get into the Champions League proper for the first time in ages, and you're thinking, right, win the first leg, easy street second leg, and off you go, and then all of a sudden you're 2-0 down, heading back to Ibrox, and you're thinking, not this again. We got through, and that night at Ibrox was, I remember it being absolutely roasting. I remember there's almost still a bit of expectation. It kind of brought over that that feeling from last year's Europa League run in terms of we turned up at Ibrox and everyone just knew we were going to win. It's hard to describe what it is until you're at Ibrox and you feel it, but everyone just felt like we've got a really good chance of doing this, and I think that just carried over into the players, and the way both teams played was just completely different and to what it was in the first leg. We dominated, and USG looked scared on that stage, and we took full advantage of it. So that was really positive. PSV was a completely different kettle of fish. They still had Cody Gakpo at that point, and he was particularly well. And I think it was a week or two after that tie that he moved to Liverpool, and we thought he would be their main threat. It turned out that Sangare in midfield was the most impressive player that none of us had ever heard of, I don't think, by that stage, but he was our most impressive player. And James Tavernier did actually quite a good job on Gakpo over the sort of 2 legs, but we got through, and we thought, right, now's the time to kick on. I'm not sure how happy I was with the squad at that point. I wasn't. We were all kind of, as Ross suggested, we were all kind of waiting on, okay, we've got this guaranteed £40 million or whatever it was that's quoted. Right, let's go buy a proper striker that's going to see us through. And I think the striker was really the only position at that stage. We were like, right, we probably need someone that's a level up. Alfredo Morelos hadn't really come back from his injury. That's where we try and invest in the squad, and it didn't really happen. And I think that was a major signifier that we didn't really realise at the time, but it was a major signifier of, I guess, what was to come as the weeks and months rolled on.
That's it. And Tommy, lastly, I'll let you have a say in this, how significant it was Rangers getting to the Champions League proper, seen as it is probably one of the few positive points of the season. Yeah.
Well, listen, I don't think I'm going to say anything different from the rest of the guys here. It's from a corporate rebuild, club rebuild perspective. It's a milestone moment, getting back at the top club competition in Europe. And so, from a balance sheet perspective, incredible impact. That's where Rangers always need to be. They need to be in and around European competition, and the UCL's the place to be. If you want to fund your squad, fund your infrastructure, move the club forward. From a emotional perspective, Ross, to your point, it means a lot to hear the Champions League music. I'm sure somewhere, Charles Green was getting up out of his hospital bed there. But this was probably also maybe the one point that's not been touched on, a bit of an endorsement for the people who had come in and changed the club, who had wrestled it away from your likes of Charles Greens, etc., who had rescued the club and then rebuilt from inside. And we haven't always agreed as a fan base every single decision that's been made, and there's been some tough moments, but that felt like a bit of a watershed. The club had been rebuilt, they had won the title, they had got back into the Champions League, and then it's a case of, right, are we slipping back, are we going forward? But those are slightly different conversations. Not enhancing after 55 is not the same conversation as we haven't won the title, and that's the bit that sometimes gets missed by people. And that's just that you could be trying to say that Champions League music was just the ending chapter as you move into the next part of what the club's history looks like.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the validation that it probably gave to the likes of Douglas Park, to the likes of Stuart Robertson, to the likes of Ross Wilson, who had all come under criticism at various different stages heading into this season. But we went from winning 55 to what was generally a poor season, but we won the Scottish Cup and we reached a Europa League final. They then went into a summer, they were unsure about the state of the squad and what needed to happen with it, but we did straight off the bat qualify for the Champions League. And if you look at that in our running order, they've got validation point after validation point, and they can turn around to support and say, we've been doing well, we are doing our job. It's up to the players on the pitch to do their job. Turns out that what the fans felt, and it's interesting the way what the fans felt and what the fans thought was very different to what the facts or the stats were shown. But I guess what the fans felt and what the fans understood comes from many years, and some people's opinions or experience, like 60, 70 years of watching Rangers. They can feel that something's not quite right, or we're not quite at the level we need to be to challenge. And I think it's that underlying feeling that then won over in the end. Sorry
to interrupt, but that's because, unlike any other business, we tritely say this all the time, and everybody says it, football's a different type of business, right? one of the key things that's a different type of business is generally if you're looking at a balance sheet or you're looking at a performance in any sort of organisation, that's what you're looking at. Looking at football, there's just a whole host of emotions that you need to get through. The figures could be telling you, right, you're in a really good place with your balance sheet, you've won something, you've rebuilt the infrastructure, whatever it looks like, but you're still not playing the brand of football on the pitch that people like, and so therefore everything's bad. I'm not saying that we're like that, or Rangers support en masse are like that, but when it comes to chatting about football and chatting about milestones and winning things, you're absolutely right. The emotional crust there is something that just doesn't matter what's in front of people's eyes, they get a feeling, and sometimes it's hard to get by that.
That's it. And everybody who's playing football cliche bingo along at home, you can scratch off football's a different business on that card.
Did I say football's a different business?
Words to those effect. I don't
Okay, I'll give you that one.
Just on a slightly different note before you move on, I just wanted to say this while we're here. See this UEFA playing the Champions League tune and the qualifiers and the playoff, that needs to be dropped, because I don't know how everyone felt that night against PSV at home, but it
felt weird, didn't it?
It took the kind of special atmosphere away in a sense, because there was a lot of people on the ground that were feeling that it just wasn't the time for it.
The champions, once you qualify.
Yeah, there was,
I
you could
that.
feel the sense in the crowd that it just wasn't right. That's not what we should be hearing at that point. So yeah, just a note to UEFA. Let's drop that. Let's just play that once you're in the group stage.
Yeah. Solid point.
Managed to miss both of those. I think I arrived in my seat about a second before the game kicked off in that one. So that's the way to do it from now on. Look, I was going to say now on to some of the doom and gloom stuff, but it's a bit gloomy from here on in.
It's a nice way to build up the rest of the podcast.
I was going to say, do keep listening,
please. Yeah, the listeners will be absolutely raring to go for this.
I know. Well, we've got to talk about it. It's an end of season review, so we have to talk about it. So Rangers ended up, as we've just discussed, getting into the Champions League proper. It was a great achievement, but despite our European success last year with reaching the final of the Europa League, there's just no other way to put it. It was a bit of an abject failure. The Champions League campaign began with a 4-0 away defeat to Ajax, and it was all a bit downhill from there. There was a comment though after that game, Ross, from Giovanni Van Bronckhorst. You all know exactly what I'm going to say. He came out and he said, if you look at the squads as we are facing now, Ajax and Liverpool, for us to compete with them, it's too much to ask. We knew it was going to be tough, and that showed today. The pressure we got, thinking on the ball control and speed of passing is all from a really, really high level. We can't compete at that level. I remember when GVB came out and said that, and I was quite annoyed, as were a lot of Rangers supporters. I just want to gauge how you were feeling round this stage, what your thoughts on him saying that was.
I don't remember being too annoyed about it at the time, to be honest with you. I was very much in the camp for the Champions League group stages that I felt it was going to be very, very tough for Rangers to get through. And I actually remember speaking to a few people from my work and things, and they were feeling that we had a great chance because Napoli and Ajax had been drawn in the group. And I just remember thinking that we maybe don't understand the difference in level between the Europa League and the Champions League. We maybe don't understand that there's such a big gap between them both. So, like, when Van Bronckhorst came out and said that, I wasn't too bothered by it. I could understand where he was coming from. So I understand a lot of the debate around the time, but for me, it's very, very difficult for Rangers to compete at that level. That doesn't mean that we have to surrender, and we go into these games and just accept defeat. But I could understand where he was coming from. And I think at that time, there was a lot of frustration from Van Bronckhorst. He didn't feel like he'd really been backed going into this Champions League campaign. So I think that's what was coming out from his press conferences. It was just feeling that, okay, we're here now and we haven't really done enough, to make an impact at this level. I can see both sides of that.
Kyle, just touching on that Ajax game, and obviously that was the comment that came after that one. I think the first 15, 20 minutes of that Ajax game, I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
It was that surprise. I did not engage in my brain that the step up from where we were in the Europa League last year and the teams we played in the Europa League last year into that Champions League group stage, into a game away to a team against like Ajax. Yeah. It just did not transition well. Yeah. We, as a team, as a way that we set up, as in terms of the players' performance, the pace of the game, we did just not. That did not translate well into that first game. And we were 3-0 down very quickly in that game, and it was like, oh no, it was. And in some games we did better than others, but that first game was a real eye opener for me, and I'd probably at that stage I hoped it was an eye opener for the board and an eye opener for the team. I'm not quite sure the penny dropped as quickly for them as it did for fans.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very fair point. Again, I'll refer, and I know I don't like going on about it too much, about the success we had in Europe the previous season, beating teams like Dortmund, Belgrade away, stuff like that. That was the kind of opposition I felt that we were maybe playing at that level, and as you said, it just completely caught us off guard there. I don't want to touch on too many of the results, Tommy, and that obviously there was a couple of heavy defeats in there. One which was maybe what's the word I'm looking for here, was a picture was made available to the support via the Rangers website, which I don't think went down too well. But at this point in time, I think there was a real change in mood against the team, especially, and the manager. What was did you think that was justified, the sort of negativity that sort of encompassed the team at this point in the season?
That's a very fair question. And again, expectations it's a pretty fickle beast most of the time. So coming off the back of winning the title, you then go, right, we've qualified for the Champions League as well. That's fantastic, right? Lots of positivity round about the club. I think the manner of the defeats and maybe the level of expectation in terms of what could be achieved with that squad came home to roost. And I remember, seeing people saying that Napoli are probably going to be also runs in that group, and you think, well, hold on a minute, that's definitely not going to be the case. Although I think, by and large, we performed all right against them at Ibrox. One of the better performances, certainly.
Until James Sands got involved.
I was going to say, yeah, aye, but that's, you can't do anything about that to a certain extent. GVB's comment that you mentioned there as well has got a gravestone feel about it. Yeah. It's one of those ones that follow you round about, right? It's fine if you actually then overperform, right, by getting results and qualifying or finishing third or whatever. If you don't, then it's, okay, are you having a shot at the board? Why wasn't there more investment or whatever? You get slightly different narratives that GVB didn't feel he was being backed, but then he actually felt that he was confident he could get some different tunes out of that particular, some of those squad players as well. It didn't work. Again, it's sometimes easy, and I'm not giving the board a pass here, but it's sometimes easy to say, they need to be backed more. Okay, well, you need to identify the right players. You need to get those agreements. Players need to come. Everything needs to happen, right? To keep playing cliche bingo, it's an ecosystem to get transfers in and out. Right? That's a phrase that will come back to haunt me, right? Because it's not one you should really use. But I mean, all of that comes in. What it did though is it stripped away the gloss of the good feeling of the club, because all you're looking is getting pretty turned over, right? And then there was didn't seem like there was any visceral reaction, either from the management, from the squad, from the club. And like I said, there's a whole host of reasons why that may or may not be the case, but all you're seeing from the stands, all you're seeing as a support is, right, we're getting a bit of a shoe in here in Europe, right? And that's me being polite. And then we're not seeing anything really happening. Yeah. So
I think though, at that stage we were doing okay in the league. We weren't setting the heather alight, but we were doing okay in terms of, we were doing the bare minimum in terms of winning. And then the first Old Firm game arrived and we got a bit of a shoe in there as well, if we are honest, at Celtic Park. And I think that combined with the Champions League results just set everything gone the downhill in terms of the way that fans thought of the team, the way that fans thought of certain players, the way that fans viewed how the board had approached that summer.
But that's how momentum works.
Yeah,
you got to remember at that point as well, though, there wasn't a lot of confidence in the team because performances were pretty poor. Results were still coming. We had that a lot under Giovanni Van Bronckhorst in the first season when he arrived. If you remember, his record was great when he first came in, but the performances were pretty poor. And I just don't think we gave ourselves enough momentum going into those group stage games. And then as soon as you are beat by 4s and 3s, there's just no way for the team to recover. Of course, we're going to go into eventually as well. The injuries come into it, right? When it comes to the Champions League, Leon King played a remarkable amount of minutes for an 18-year-old, really, that's hardly kicked the ball for Rangers. So it just shows that the kind of how big the task was for this Rangers side, but there just wasn't a lot to hold on to at that point, and the Champions League, really, that campaign just felt at the wrong time for the squad. Eventually, that was really the way you looked at it at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think you used a good phrase there, Tommy, when you said it stripped the gloss off of everything, because it really did. I think it caught a lot of us off guard, the manner of those defeats and the lack of action from, as you said, off field and on field. But the European campaign came to a pretty abrupt end. It was another defeat for Rangers at home, 3-1 to Ajax, and then we've got this infamous run up to until the World Cup break. And there's three significant results here, Ross, that I'd quite like to touch upon. We've got we played St Johnstone away. We were defeated 2-1 there. Then we had the game at home to Hearts, where Malik Tillman scored the winner. I remember you and I being at that game, and it was a terrible performance. I was stunned that we came away with that from that game with a 1-0 win. And then there was the St Mirren game, where it was 1-1 again away from home. That St Mirren game was on the 12th of November, and on the 21st, 9 days later, Rangers released a statement saying Rangers Football Club confirms today it has parted company with manager Giovanni Van Bronckhorst. The board would like to put on record his sincere thanks to Gio for all his efforts in his appointment since his appointment of manager. Unfortunately, recent results have not met neither ours nor Giro's expectations, and we have taken this difficult decision today. Everyone at Rangers wishes Gio every success in the future. What was your initial response to that news? I know you and I did the podcast. I did it live from my work that day, because it was I was gutted that they had to go. But how did you feel about it?
Oh, it was the right decision.
Yeah,
it was a long time coming. I think a lot of Rangers fans felt of that. I think you've actually let them off there. I think there was another result in there. I think
was it Livingston at home? Yeah,
drew with Livingston at home. If you remember, John Lundstrom scored in the last 5 minutes, and it was the same feel as that Hearts game, where there was nothing. And this was a phrase I used quite often with Van Bronckhorst when it came to how the team were performing. There was nothing to buy into. There was no patterns of play. There was no intensity about the team. You could clearly see that a lot of these players were very, very low in confidence, and it was over a 1 or 2 month period that you just knew. We all understand football now, right? Mm-hmm. Eventually it gets to a point where you just know it's not going to recover. And I think that's where we'd got to. Rangers fans went back and forth on this. Yeah. I think that result in Perth that day against St Johnstone was the day he should have went, because I can't actually remember the St Johnstone fullback's name, but he scores a 25, 30 yarder from the edge of the box, and St Johnstone had offered nothing that day. And I remember the response from the Rangers team that day was so poor. Yeah. If you remember that famous cut from John Lundstrom, he goes to drive out with the ball to the right-hand side. I think he thinks Sakala's going to come short. He ends up playing the pass, and instead of responding to losing the ball, he just throws his arms in the air. And you could see at that point the players were not playing for the manager. Yeah. That's not a team there that are trying to do everything they can to get a result. And I think that was the day that he should have been let go. I did understand the club trying to get to the World Cup break, trying to keep the points gap as it was. I believe the points gap at the time was around 4 points. And we all felt as Rangers fans very much, let's just get the points in the bag. Let's get to the World Cup break. Let's hopefully bring players back next season, revitalise the squad and go again. And it's not a very nice thing to say, but I think the players maybe knew themselves that performances weren't maybe going to continue into the next part of next season. Yeah. If you potentially don't perform now, will the manager move on and you get someone fresh in? We all know modern day football, that's how it works. Players have a lot of power. Yeah. So, I think it came too late, but ultimately, it was the right decision. Van Bronckhorst had to be moved on. I think we all have a lot of affection for Giovanni Van Bronckhorst. Yep. That run to Seville will live with us forever. We all of us in this room were there. We were all in that stadium that night. It hurts. It still hurts to this day, but that he is the manager that took us there. So there will always be a lot of affection for him, but it was too far gone, and especially when you're at that point where you think, just keep the gap to what it is, and it goes to 9. Yeah. We all knew at that point it was going to be very, very difficult for Rangers to turn this league title around, so a change had to be made.
The point you make there, though, is the really, I'm not saying the points aren't important, but it's the manner of the performances. They were never domestically, to your point as well, they were never actually the type of performances that give you a lot of confidence. Because sometimes you can drop points and you go, but we're absolutely smashing teams and it will come good. And players get a bit of leeway with that. It was all a bit one-dimensional, and it always felt like it's only a matter of time before we actually end up getting caught out here. And then we'd been through some pretty poor results, and then you get things like that, and you think, if we're seeing that from the stands, just to knit together that point, the players are feeling it, and then you get that. Do I really want to go that extra yard? Am I really wanting to run through the brick wall? I think that's another cliche there. I'm determined to tick them all off here, by the way. It's going to be amazing, right? And we'll just do a clip show of all my cliches at the end, right? But it does, it generates, it washes back and forward for the stands to the pitch. And people go, nah, it's not happening. Yeah. And then as soon as, I think, particularly with Rangers, a club the size of Rangers, once there's blood in the water and people think, oh, he's not quite got it, it's hard to turn it round. Oddly enough, don't want to go too far back. Gerrard, after a Hearts game at Tynecastle, where it looked like he'd given up, and then he turned it around. Is one of the very few times I can remember a manager being able to do that. Gio didn't seem to have that personality.
Yeah,
and I don't think the team
just looking at that period from, and I'll take it back to the Livingston game at Ibrox that John Lundstram scored at 91st minute or whatever, and then we were still pushing for the winner. From that point of the Livingston game through to, I would say, to the World Cup break and that St Mirren, a full-time whistle, that St Mirren game, that is where the league was lost this year. That is that 4 or 5 week period is where the league was lost, and that is where a lot of the animosity towards the board comes from.
Yep. Because
I think actually, if I remember correctly, after that Livingston game, like Tommy said, there's fans smelt blood in the water, and fans were already saying, right, it's time for a change now, because it's that, again, it's down to that sixth sense that some fans have in their emotional involvement, and it's they sense it's going a certain way, and if we act quickly, then maybe we can avoid it going that way. And one thing the board did not do was act quickly. Yeah. And as Ross said as well, if they sack him after the St Johnstone game, you maybe get that new manager bounce or the interim manager bounce for a game against St Mirren. You get the 3 points. You go into the World Cup break on a wee bit of a, right, things are going up. We've got a bit of time to sort of sort ourselves out, get a new manager in place, and off we go again. But they delayed it that bit further just to get to the World Cup break, and that's absolutely criminal, to be honest. And that's where the board are entirely culpable at that point for us falling so far behind, and really to a point where it was irretrievable. And I think as fans, even throughout that World Cup break, we knew it was irretrievable, but a decision had to be made. Probably sacking him after the Livingston game is harsh. Yeah. But after the St Johnstone game is where the board needed to go, right, enough's enough. And what I couldn't believe actually was that after the St Mirren game, it took them 9 days. Took them 9 days after that St Mirren game to go, actually, Gio, sorry, thanks very much, but see you later.
Yeah, but 9 days could be legal wrangling, contracts, agents, people not being in the loop and stuff like that. I mean, I get your point, but I think counting the days
There's got to be action though, and if they've had enough time of it building.
Yeah, but if I say you're getting sacked.
See you later.
No, but I don't disagree with your point. What I'm saying though is, referencing the 9 days, it's probably not the right metric there, because that could be, right, I need to contact the club lawyers, they need to contact Gio's lawyers, that has to be thrashed out, there might be a compensation package, whatever that looks like, before you then announce. You can't just announce. Remember, football's not separate from employment legislation in the UK, you know what I mean? You can't just arbitrarily turn around and go, by the way, that was a shocker. And we've just posted a press release saying you're not getting in the team bus. Right. Not that I'm saying they would do that.
No, the club should have all that working in the background in the build-up to the St Mirren game. Do you think the St Mirren game was the be-all and end-all? If Gio wins that St Mirren game, he stays and he's there heading into the Hibs game after the World Cup break? I think
it's a possibility of that.
Yeah, I do as well. Genuinely. I think they wanted, 100%. Because of that Europa League run, they wanted to give him as much time as possible. And after that St Mirren result, I think the board realised that it was going to be very, very difficult to turn things around. And I think there was you have to remember as well with Giovanni Van Bronckhorst, a lot of fans changed their perception of him after that defeat to Celtic earlier on the season, because that was twice we had went to Parkhead and the team did not perform to an acceptable level at all. I mean, they were turned over completely twice, and a lot of fans felt at that point. And I actually have to say myself, something turned for me with Van Bronckhorst that day. I wasn't convinced that he should be sacked, but I did feel it was going to be very, very difficult for him to turn it around. And I think the board maybe tried to play on as much as possible that, we still have most fans that buy into this manager, and they wanted to give him as much time as possible. And I really do think when it got to that St Mirren result, they've just felt, we don't have another choice now. we have to let the manager go.
I think there's two quick points to that, and I know you're keen to move us on, Kyle. I can see you staring at your agenda there, to be honest with you, right? But just two quick things. I think to some extent it was the manner of the defeat against Celtic, whereby Celtic are a good side, well-oiled machine, all that type of stuff, but they didn't do anything surprising. People knew what the tactics were going to be. Yeah. It didn't look like Gio had done anything to counter that. And then the board will also be sitting there to some extent going, right, how long do we keep him on? Do we give him a chance? Let's say he doesn't get the bullet, right? And then he manages to turn it around, Gerrard-esque.
Yeah.
Then everybody's in the support going, it's great to have a board that aren't reactionary or trigger happy and they've stuck by their man. Yeah. You know, so it's sometimes hard. I'm not overly backing the board there. They've made lots of mistakes and I think they did wait slightly too long. But at the same time, they're weighing up all those consequences as well. How do you actually make the right decision in the right time period? Taking into account the same things that we're saying. He's got injury issues. He's trying to get a tune out of some players that we know we need to move on. How much of it is the manager versus some of these players who've hidden in a jersey sometimes, under Gerrard and under Gio, and are still at the club and now being moved on. So, I mean, I just, don't want to get it all again, but sometimes when you scope back, placing it all on one person's shoulders or on a board's shoulders, it's not always right. I always feel that the players get a pass with this stuff and it doesn't always feel right to me.
I think you look at what you can change though, and to me it's incomprehensible that Giovanni Van Bronckhorst could have won that, snuck a 2-1 win away to St Mirren and been walking out that tunnel for that game against Hibs, first game after the World Cup break. To me that is, I can't see how a situation where that would happen. The St Johnstone result was the final straw
100%,
for me. It wasn't just that, it's probably reached the end now. That was it should have been sacked like 3 weeks ago.
Yeah,
point for me. And so for the idea that he could have snuck a result in Paisley and then stayed in charge of us is completely incomprehensible. And it's bad enough that the board waited so long to sack him that they did. If they had waited even longer, then I dread to think what the feeling amongst the support would have been.
I fear for your direct reports and your normal job, to be honest with you. There we go.
Yeah, well, I think we can all agree that it was the correct decision to let Van Bronckhorst go, and that the board took too long to make that decision. I think that's a fair comment, but he did go. I think before we move on to the next talking point in terms of Michael Beale coming in, it would be completely remiss of me not to mention the injuries that we've had this season. I think
Sorry, actually, don't want to throw you off that, right? But I don't want to walk past the fact as well. As much as I really like Michael Beale, him turning up at Ibrox when Giovanni Van Bronckhorst was on his deathbed, so to speak, wasn't a great look. In all honesty,
totally agree.
And people might take me to task on that, but I think Michael Beale knew what he was doing with that.
100%. I totally agree with you there on that one, Tommy. But look, listen, and I just want to touch on some of the players that Van Bronckhorst, all the players that he brought in the summer, basically there. Ben Davies, Ridvan Yilmaz, Rabi Matondo, Antonio Cholak, Tom Lawrence and John Suter. Hopefully that's it. I've pronounced all them correct for you there, Ross. But I just wanted to say that at some point, all of those players this season have had significant injuries or been out for seriously lengthy periods of time. And that's not forgetting Morelos, Kamal Roof, who's got a loyalty card for the Rangers treatment room at the moment. Connor Golton, who apart from his heart scare, I don't think has ever had as lengthy an injury layoff as this. Stephen Davis as well, who let's not forget. And then there was a few wee niggles with Arfield, Barisic, Kent. I'm sure I'm missing out players.
Ryan Jack.
Ryan Jack, that's the big one, yeah. I was going to say, I can feel you all going, you've not mentioned a player.
I think every single member of that squad this season's had injury problems. Yeah. Even James Tavernier at times, if you remember, there was a lot of fans claiming that he must have been playing with an injury because he wasn't shown his actual, true talent, really, that we've seen.
Yeah. Did Hadji make it onto your list?
Oh, I think he didn't make it on my list.
He was too long term.
Yeah, I know. I know there was going to be loads of players that I missed out there, but Ross, for what it's worth, I totally agree with you about the James Tavernier point. I think he was playing for large parts of this season carrying an injury. But do you think that this significantly impacted our season, or is it just an excuse?
Oh, this is a tough one because I'm pretty certain that you can't say that it's not had an impact in the season. And I know a lot of people like to say that Rangers should have a squad capable of dealing with injuries, but not to this level.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking of something earlier when we were planning the podcast and things, and I was having that. I thought back to we've seen in the last couple of years, Liverpool have went on a really good runs and they've played lots of fixtures. And the next season they've had a lot of injuries, right? And they've had a bit of a dip in form. I think that's what we've had with Rangers. I think that squad had played at such a high level for so long last season. I think it was it around 70 games that I think the squad had played.
Yep.
I think Joe Aribo maybe played as many of them as humanly possible. And I think it's just a consequence of that. We've seen this season that it just caught up with them, to be honest with you. Now, of course, there's questions over the medical department right now, and I think there has to be, injuries of this scale. You have to take a closer look at it, especially when you hear about certain players getting back to, either getting close to full fitness and they have a relapse. Let's look at Tom Lawrence, for example. It was coming out that he was close to a return. He's back in the training pitch. You then hear that he's had a wee bit of a setback. It was actually very similar to John Souttar. He's had a wee bit of a setback, and then he's out for 3 or 4 months. Of course, that has to be looked at. The overall point, of course, it has an impact. If big players are being ruled out for long periods, it's got to have an impact. Connor Goldson was the big one for me.
Yep.
And I don't know if we all felt the same that night in Ibrox when he went down against Liverpool, but I just remember, putting my hands to my head, and I felt at that point we were really in trouble.
Yeah.
This guy is essentially the captain without the armband, in my opinion. And we had a problem when he went down that night, and I just don't think you've seen for the next couple of months, we just did not recover without him. So, look, I think it's fair to say that Rangers maybe should have still been able to perform at a level to get them closer in terms of domestic. I think they were completely done by injuries when it came to the Champions League campaign, unfortunately.
Yep.
But we have to sit back and say, of course it had an impact. Of course it did. Any squad would struggle with their best players out. That is just football. That's it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, especially in that Connor Goldson point. I remember that night when he went down in Liverpool, and I think the two of us were deep in conversation about it, and yeah, it did. It was not good having a largely untested centre half pairing for most of that part of the season. Craig, I'll come on to you here for the next talking point in terms of. I was trying to think about how to phrase and word this question. I don't like using the word blame, but where do you think this stems from? Is it recruitment? Is it the medical team? Was it the intensity of the training at the time? Or because I know there was a big song and dance made about I don't know if you remember the AI technology that Rangers brought in Zone 7 to track and predict when injuries were going to happen. Where does the problem with injuries stem from for you?
Before I come on to where I think the problem stems from, the Zone 7 stuff, I remember reading about that and then seeing the list of clubs that had Zone 7 involved in it. Liverpool were one of them, and there's various clubs across Europe, and every single one of them had major injury lists. And I remember thinking, oh no, I was like, this explains a lot, but I was like, oh, this can't be good for us going forward. And you would kind of question why the club has went down that route if looking at the evidence that other clubs have experienced with injuries, especially the ones who've been using that technology, have been experiencing quite significant injuries. I think in terms of where the blame lies for our injuries this season, a lot of it's bad luck. Stuff happens in games. Connor Goldson's one was a pretty innocuous thing. He went over on his ankle, it looked like, at the time, and he couldn't continue. You never know quite how serious these are. Tom Lawrence, for example, 92nd minute against Ross County at the halfway line, he tries to block a pass, and that's him out for the rest of the season.
I can hear JB every time going, sub him, every single time Tom Lawrence is mentioned.
But I think on that side of things, some of it is down to bad luck. Some of it, which is only a realisation I've probably come to in the last 4 or 5 weeks or so, is down to the point Ross made about the load that some of these players had last season in terms of the intensity of the games, the level that they had to play at for such an extended and prolonged period of time. Definitely has got to be a factor, especially considering so many of the same players moved into this season. And I guess that's where you have to look at the recruitment side of things, and that's where you have to look at, you mentioned there 6 or 7 players, I don't actually know how many players it was you mentioned that we brought in,
yes,
but none of them made huge contributions to our squad for the vast majority of this season. Some of them have came back, some of them have had their opportunities more post-split. If you look at particularly guys like John Souttar, Ridvan Yilmaz, even Rabi Matondo, they made zero contribution to Rangers up to that point. So you're then going back to the well with the guys who have been playing those 68, 70 games, however many it was last season, and you're naturally going to get injuries. We had a discussion not that long ago about should John Souttar play all the minutes possible for him to the end of the season, and some people were saying, well, Michael Beale's got to manage those minutes so he doesn't have that a risk injury more. And actually, he's not played that much this season, so he should be able to play these minutes, and he needs that game time. And John Souttar, I think, has become one of our best defenders, and to me, and we'll come on to it towards the end, but he's our starting centre half alongside Connor Goldson now. But the risk of injury and the impact that has on us couldn't have been exemplified more than in this season, when we didn't strengthen the squad enough at the start. We didn't have good enough backup players to come in. The forward line is a completely other discussion that we could have for about half an hour. But it's just we didn't have good enough backups to fill in that spot, and that's where one of the major downfalls of this season lay, and that the first team and their key players did get injured, and the players that came in to replace them were just nowhere near good enough.
Sorry, just picking up on that as well, because I think that's the key point. So you've got a squad that didn't have the depth to it, right? Even though we maybe told ourselves it did. And then you get injuries to some of the new players and some of the key players at the same time as the rest of the key players are going off the boil in terms of form. I mean, really, and we'll come to Player of the Year and all that type of good stuff, right, at some point, I'm sure. But could you really say that any of the key players within the squad have really performed this season consistently? So if you're saying, right, you take those building blocks out your side where you need a spine of 4 or 5 players that are always relatively performing and dragging the team forward, you know, those big players in the big moments. And then you say the players we brought in have been injured or not performing as well, alongside those established players not performing. That's a recipe for disaster. I don't care who's in the dugout. All of those things together is what Rangers were facing into. That doesn't excuse any of the players for not performing. I'm just saying it. That thread right through that is, I don't think at any point in time, apart from qualifying for the Champions League, did Rangers have a reasonably full complement, and people were performing for a game or two.
Yep.
You know, at a decent enough level. You know, you get into that Champions League cycle and then all just started to unravel.
Yeah.
You know, it's not an excuse. You know, some players should definitely have stood up more, but you can pretty much consistently drag that all the way through the season, even post Michael Beale to some extent, although he's been able to get a much better tune with some key additions.
Yeah. The last question I'd like to ask you, Tommy, before we move away from the injury chat, because I know we've talked about it quite a lot, is recruitment. So I'm looking at some of the players here. Ben Davies that we brought in, he had previous injury problems, centre half before he came to Rangers. John Souttar, very well known about his injury problems as well before he moved. Going a couple of transfer windows back, Kamal Roof, Philip Hollander, both known with poor injury records. Is this something that we have to take into consideration, especially this summer, maybe looking at players that don't have such awful track records when it comes to their injuries?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a conscious decision. Obviously, you know, if any player who's got a significant injury history goes through additional or enhanced medical checks as well. It's not as if we just close our eyes and go, right, best of luck. It doesn't
feels that way sometimes.
It does. Listen, I don't disagree with you, right? But it's not as if the club isn't, you know, elite level medical support and analysis, right? The question you're probably asking there is, are we shopping in the right pool when we're going after these guys? But they're satisfying the medical checks, and because of that history, they come at a discount. So you're playing both sides of that coin there. I think Michael Beale recently has been talking about, I won't be signing veterans, etc. I take that to mean that he's looking at players not just in terms of age, but in terms of physicality, who's been put through the mill. Because sometimes you can have younger players who have played 70 games a season or whatever. You've done that consistently when you're 23, 24, your body's starting to, you know, feel the pace of that.
Yeah.
And so all of that needs to be played into the recruitment cycle. Will we still take risks on players who've had serious injuries? Of course we will, right? Because they come good sometimes. You know, we're all hoping that Yanis Hadji comes back in a really good, you know, vein of form as well. Do we want to be bringing in players who've got, especially recent injuries, big injuries in their history, and putting them into key positions immediately with no sort of backup? I don't think you'll find those are the marquee signings.
Yeah.
There'll just be some players who have got some. And again, don't want to go down the rabbit hole on it, but when you say injury, you're talking key injuries.
Yeah.
ACLs, this type of stuff, as opposed to, right, they've got a niggling muscle injury that they've had a few times.
Yep.
So, I mean, players are going to have that. I don't think Rangers will be signing too many of that in the future.
I think it's an important balance to strike when you look at a player like Kamaru. There's no way a player with his record and his calibre would sign for Rangers had he not had those injury concerns previously. We've paid a significant chunk of money for him, and I think that's where the frustration comes from fans in terms of he was a big investment. We've seen how good he can be when he is actually on the park. He's just not on the park anywhere near enough or available to be on the park anywhere near enough. But I agree with Tommy. I think that's a gamble the club occasionally has to take. It's maybe taken too many of those gambles in recent seasons, but occasionally the club has to take those gambles to try and get players that are probably a wee bit above the level that we are naturally going to attract as a club, and hope that actually that they've just had bad luck and their injuries previously, and they come on to a run where they can play 2 or 3 seasons pretty much straight.
Also in that as well, you look at Souttar's not a perfect example, but he's an example nonetheless, right? So he comes in and he's got injury problems in his history, gets an injury here as well. It takes a bit of time to come back. Now he's back though, and he's performing at a really high level, and he looks like he's going to be a standout for us. So that's just a timing thing as well. It was a different type of injury from the one that's in his history, but people naturally go, oh, but he had that big injury history, he must just be prone to injuries. Well, they can be different injuries, right? But when he comes back and he starts to add value to the squad and add value on the pitch, you go, well, he's a really good player. So at the same time as criticising the club for going and getting a guy who's got injury history, you then go, but they've signed a guy who looks really good in a jersey.
Yeah.
Okay, so which is it then? You both part of the same conversation. It's just if you stock your team with too many of them and they all get injuries at the same time. I mean, a Helander, had a pretty ropey background, but nobody would disagree that he's a good defender when he plays. But then it catches up with him. So it's balancing act. You can take a couple of risks in the squad. You shouldn't be looking at 5, 6 players who've got that type of history in your squad as well.
Yeah, totally.
Just to add to that quickly, I know we've spent a lot of time on
I
this,
know.
but the club
I'm starting to get an injury just thinking about these.
The club will continue to take risks in this market, right? Where we are in terms of the transfer market food chain, the club will have to take risks with certain players if they have certain injuries. Just a quick one before we move on. We have been very unlucky this season with injury. You look at Ridvan Yilmaz, he didn't have any record of history. He picks up one of the worst hamstring injuries you can possibly get. Antonio Cholak, I think he was speaking about it in the last game of the season against St Mirren, that's the longest period he's really been dealing with an injury. Ben Davies was kind of thrown into it when he had an injury. He had to play. We didn't have anyone else. So we have really been quite unlucky this season as well. But in terms of the overall point, the club will continue to take risks in that market. We have to, because there are players in there that can bring the technical floor up of the squad, and that is it. Tells you how bad the season it's been. We just want to spend our time talking about injuries.
I know.
Right, okay, right.
I know that's it. But to be fair, the fact we've went through a whole, 10 minutes talking about injuries and not mentioned Doc Waller, well done everybody for that one. But
I thought we were getting out the other side there before you jumped in.
So thanks for watching and listening to part 1. Remember to like and subscribe and turn on notifications for when part 2 drops.